My name is Brendan Vance. I'm 31 years old, and I live around Vancouver, British Columbia. I work professionally as a video game programmer. Been doing that for like 8 years or something. I'm also one of the co-founders at Heart Projector, which is a sort of alternative video game arcade and community organization around Vancouver. And I've done a little bit of commercial video game writing and a lot of like non-commercial video game essays.
Is there such a thing as a commercial video game essay?
Once upon a time, there are people I remember doing that.
I seem to remember, but that's not a recent memory. Although that is a thing that in my circle of, in the way that this stuff works, my circle of friends and colleagues who I've never met face to face, that is a thing that post-pandemic, a lot of them are kind of very ruefully, maybe even angrily nostalgic for. So we can definitely, just you laughing on that question means we have a lot of different directions we can go in together. But I can tell you to try to spin it a different way, like something I've been thinking about a lot in my work and in just other cultural critics' work who pay attention to games. Like, I think it's very easy to go down that road and kind of make the focus be like why we're so jaded about games, or I don't want to put words in your mouth. So I think actually the more interesting question is like, well, why are we still paying attention to them? So I know you make games too, and you bother to write non-commercial essays. So why are they kind of still worth paying attention to, and why is there that tension, you think?
Are we asking about like video games as a medium? Why still pay attention? Or essays in particular?
Also to the degree where you want to write about them, because I think that's a step beyond.
So like the conclusion that I kind of come to it like recently in my life, it's true that like I've been continuing to write these like little essays for probably, 6 years after that ceased to be a particularly mainstream pursuit. I would peg the time of Gamergate as when the end really started for this kind of stuff being a subject of like growth within our culture, the serious consideration of video games or something like that. The reason I've continued to do it is simply that I have to. The words for the essays start to kind of roil around in my brain, and I kind of can't stop thinking about them, and it's a matter of like expelling them from my body more than it really is some political objective I have or some hope I have about what will happen. It's just like games are part of me as a consequence of how my life developed. Mm-hmm. It's just this thing that is kind of stuck to me that I kind of can't unstick from. It's not important because it's objectively important. It's just important to me. Yeah. And I kind of am, I'm kind of trapped within it to some extent, I would say.
I think of it for me, because I don't think it's a typical thing people do of like, hey, I'm going to make appointments with total strangers and talk to them about this stuff.
Right.
And I'm going to go ahead and do that for years. The word I think of it is like, well, is this a compulsion? Like, you talk about it like you have to do it. And it sounds so cheesy to say, but I'm like, yeah, I feel that way too, but I don't know how I can explain that to people. I don't know why it's like that. So I don't know. I don't really have a question there, but it's like...
Yeah. Hey, I would take it a step further than compulsion. Sure. And like even consider it addiction, right? It's just sort of, for me, it's an addiction to, I guess, just wanting this all to go somewhere or to see a hopeful target in the future for it all, lights at the end of the tunnels that it seems like every type of video game person is in,
Yeah.
It's the reason that I always want to combine the words together and put them into these essays and do this trade of commenting about video games relates to the rather high volume, the conspicuously high volume of things happening in the game industry and in game society that I don't want to happen. and then, the disappointingly low volume of things happening that I do want to happen. And for me, that's, I want to see there be more support for alternative game making styles, for small games, for alternative games. I feel there's never enough for that there's too much focus on the big ones. And the words that start roiling in my brain just kind of come from my sense of unfairness about all of this, and I guess a desire to somehow bring it into a more just point of view.
So can you talk a little bit about, because that's something I had a journey with, was with this, is like I realized a couple of years ago, okay, I'm not trying to affect any outcome exactly. I'm just trying to, document these perspectives and I guess build a living index. And honestly, I could dress it up in all sorts of fancy words, but like I was just trying to illuminate my own ignorances and things I was curious about and things I felt like after, well, now it's been 15 years of, working as a media person or a journalist or a critic. It was just like all these questions that I had that I felt like, well, are other people curious about these things too? And how come I can't really read about these things that much? I mean, you can much more now, but like, can you talk a little bit about like your journey of like, maybe you started off there where you're like, all right, well, this is just because this is more of a me thing than a bigger cosmic capital V video game thing. Because you're saying like you're basically not trying to necessarily change things, but you're reacting against something out there.
Yeah, I would agree with the way you characterized that it's no longer out of like some expectation of change. Maybe it's out of like, I feel a sense of responsibility for the younger people that are coming in and doing it and, wanting this continuity. But in the beginning, yeah, it definitely didn't start out this way for me. I mean, hey, when I was in university and thought I was gonna, be a big time game designer person or whatever, this would have been like indie had hit in a big way by then already. This would have been after 2008 or so. Mm-hmm. So like the notion of these games like Braid being significant cultural milestones was floating around. I was reading a lot of essays from people like Lee Alexander, and a lot of she was better at this, but the people who were less good at writing these essays, you would hear things all the time about how the point of games crit, like it's really important. We're developing a vocabulary, a language about how games can be designed and made, and we're learning how to like move this medium forward towards not only increased prosperity, like financial prosperity, but also, enriched cultural experiences or something like that. And I guess I did get a little excited about this idea that we were all joining and contributing to this base of like knowledge and culture, which is what that's a really popular idea, I think, in critical fields. I think in film you can see a lot of that in history. And that was sort of what I wanted. And then the journey was just gradually learning and studying all of the ways in which that wasn't really possible, and all the ways in which those sentences, like we're growing a vocabulary of games, kind of are lies, I guess.
That's what I was going to ask you, was like, do you think that's true? Because I think we say that's true, but so I don't know if there's like a gated nature to like who's allowed to quote unquote affect this change, or if we just say that because it sounds good and we don't want to actually think about all the work. That either we're like writing about and kind of exposing like who's complicit in it, or who's standing in the way of it, or who's profiting off of, what's perceived as the status quo. I don't know. I have some very vague senses of it. It's a weird thing to describe because you bump against people that you really don't meet face to face in navigating these things. And then at least for me, it was like, well, is this all in my head, or is this actually the way it is and other people feel that way too? And I can tell you 5 years later, it's not just me.
Oh yeah, everything is so much clearer now, right?
I don't know about that. I've just made it fuzzier in other new areas.
Yeah. Shouldn't have said everything, but certainly those things are a bit clearer now. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Oh man. So like, I think that there have always, like at every point within this, it's 2020 now, the internet sort of kicked up proper, let's say around the year 2000, we've had this tradition of the video game essay, whatever that is, it's amorphous self, for like 20 years. There have always been people working really intensely within it. Sometimes because they need to publish 5 articles today, or else, you know, to keep their job or whatever. Other times it's just people who really care. But what I think is lacking, it's almost like the work. There's no like topsoil to catch the work and retain it so that the vocabulary grows. I think it's like if there ever were to be some kind of, you know, shared language for talking about games, blah, blah, blah. The problem is not that it's too big to build or that people aren't building it. It's that, like, it's being eroded by these capitalistic forces at probably a higher rate than all of us are frantically, like, slapping new essays onto it.
I think you're right. I mean, yeah, it's tough because, I mean, I feel like we come from a similar place in just the very short time, 10, 12 minutes we've talked so far. So I don't want to make my responses be all about me and kind of my experiences, but I don't know. I mean, I guess, like, I'll try to shift the focus back to you, which I guess is where this should be in a conversation with you. But, like, you know, we were talking in email about, you described it as like a childish veneration of winners. And that's certainly a particular thing that's kind of, quote unquote, blocking, quote unquote, progress, or just things moving in different or new directions. So, I mean, I think you throw out Notch as an example, but just to kind of abstract, like, how do you think these types of figures kind of obscure or distract in terms of, you know, making the spotlight of the way we think about games, or the way we can think about thinking about games, like, to make that be broader? I say broader, and that isn't quite what I mean. I just mean, like, new perspectives on thinking about games.
Yeah.
Because it feels like it's narrowing. It feels like it's not expanding.
I would agree with that, yeah. The lens that I really love to use, or one of my favorite lenses, is like the historical lens. And the way that I would quickly, like, describe history is, you know, it's just a story it's the story we're currently telling ourselves, about what happened, about the way it happened. We know, of course, that history is not like some objective record of, like, the stuff that took place. It's really more of this subjectivity. It's written by the victors. You know, history is written by the victors, really popular quote. And in the context of these video game essays in our little cultural field and all of that stuff, the way that I would apply the historical lens is to kind of look at the way so much of the writing being done, and especially, you know, in the more commercial spaces, it's almost just, it's a history being written by the victors. It's an attempt to create a justification or a story that contextualizes why whichever person who just won did in fact win. So, for example, we can't really say that Minecraft it wasn't that a bunch of critics built up this, like, understanding that Minecraft was great, or even that it spread through grassroots. It's sort of like, what happened was, it was an industrial smash hit that made millions of dollars. And that allowed all of those attention-focusing platforms out there to seize on it as an important way to focus attention. And so it became a big deal for the money reasons. And then it was necessary to generate the history of how Minecraft took over the industry. And then we have stories about, you know, the Craft 'em Up game, and how that was always destined to be really the thing that would take over and is the best game. It's always this retroactive sort of fitting of the narrative around the biggest financial winners. And that, I think, is one of the big sort of things that tends to make it stuck. Because, like, commercially, you mostly succeed by doing the same shit over and over. That's not a very controversial claim, right? Like, video games tend to be sequels, movies tend to be sequels, et cetera, et cetera.
Or remakes.
Or remakes. but the people writing the words who have to make everything seem fresh and new is kind of like what they're here to do. They don't get to change the fact that it's the same thing over and over. So you end up with people trying to find ways to act like it's not, or something like that. And so it's this narrative of perpetual progress, but the actual material reality we know is sort of mired in kind of like repetitious, like product cycle-y stuff.
Well, I think one thing that's kind of changed, I mean, if you're talking about in the last 9 years, you know, for when, I guess like when you, I don't know if that's when you started writing about it or what, but I think definitely 9 years ago you would have had an awareness of kind of, I mean, I hate even really talking about this stuff, like just the kind of myopia that's kind of synonymous with video game culture or video game writing. Like, I think a lot of that has kind of shifted away, although you mentioned Gamergate, which I think is a good line in the sand for many reasons, but now we have this other new line in the sand that like everyone in all subcultures and I guess macro cultures are going through. I mean, I guess more recently, like, are there ways you're sensing already, like, post-pandemic, like, the way that it seems like bigger thinking about video games is kind of shifting, or it kind of has killed off? Like, we talked about, like, I mean, maybe it was just in my circle, but there was this feeling that, like, well, these kind of essays are just never going to be a thing you can get paid for anymore, you know, because, well, budgets are getting slashed everywhere, and I think it's really hard to argue on a broad platform that, hey, thinking about video games in a different way is like everyone's top priority right now. I mean, I think it's still, whether it's a compulsion or not, I think it's work that should continue, but obviously it can't continue if there's no money in it anywhere.
Well, that's an interesting, there's a lot of interesting stuff there. Mm-hmm. I would say I don't personally yet have like a well-developed idea about like what this pandemic might ascribe, you know, or say about the future of like games and games writing.
So far,
I would say that
Animal Crossing.
Oh yeah, it's still possible to like flood the social networks with the promotional materials and make everybody talk about a really big game release. Mm-hmm. So that hasn't gone away. I guess we can all feel comforted about that.
Sure, we could feel that way.
You can choose however you want to feel about that game's success.
Sure.
Choosing whether it succeeds is not necessarily a thing that you get to do.
Right.
So one thing I would say that I feel good about right now is we're again seeing another wave of like post-forest fire growth of like some more newer essayist type people. There are publications like Rebind. Rebind has a disc that I did about doing highfalutin games crit. And that's always like an energizing thing while it's available, you know.
Yeah.
But for me, because I have been around a little bit longer, I'm certainly not one of the oldest school cats in writing about games world, 7 years ago. You know, I've seen these new generations kind of come up and then get starved of funding and then go away. Maybe like 2 or 3 times since the 2000 era, where I'm enjoying it for laughs and hoping for the best, but feel as way to accommodate. Without money, it will never happen. Mm-hmm. And that's where I'm my voice pumped back through my headphones. So that's where I feel like there could be a significant future. Like the origin of writing about video games was non-commercial, I would guess, or at least no. The origin of the stuff I thought was cool was like the blogosphere, and that was very non-commercial.
Right.
And I do feel hopeful that there could be a future for this type of stuff that is just less rooted in the commercialism of it all.
Yeah, I agree. I guess I've been in a couple more years than you, I guess, and so I definitely know what you're talking about when you talk about these crops of people that show up
doing these words. But there's still this kind of alternative thing that people like Raph Koster and Greg Kostikian were kind of pushing for at the apex of the last big hump, like around 2014. The idea that, like poetry or something, this would be more a trade or just a craft for people who do it because they admire it, that is kind of just not thought to be something that is a sort of viable capitalist niche or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, you were talking about the topsoil, and I guess this would be part of it. Like, I'm sure you've observed this too. Like, I've noticed this with this, when there are crops of people that come in, they write some stuff. Some even make these large proclamations that they're done thinking about video games. They're never going to write about games again. And I guess we're supposed to beg them to please stay. But I think even that is part of I guess the question is well, why is there not much of a lineage or a continuum for people who, put in hard work, curating, thinking, writing, or even building up things that come close to institutions, thinking about games, and then there doesn't seem to be a place to graduate to or a place to matriculate to. Not that they have to, but what's your sense of that? Why is it just general media problems, or do you think there's something else going on in games where you kind of just are kind of stuck doing what you do and you can't really expect it necessarily to lead you anywhere else? Not that it has to, but it would stand to reason that if you know a lot about a thing, maybe it would be valuable.
Yeah. So we do have some institutions. We have institutions like Critical Distance. That's one of my kind of go-to favorite video game institutions. I was tweeting just the other day about this subject, right? About my frustration that there are people who serve as the weekly roundup editors for Critical Distance. So they basically spend a year or multiple years of their lives reading everything that anybody wrote about video games that week and deciding which ones they thought were most relevant, which you think would give somebody an extremely valuable wealth of experience.
Right.
And to me, it is a valuable wealth of experience, but there's this curious thing about it that it's not commercially or monetarily a valuable experience. And we know this because people don't seem to exit the Critical Distance editing job and then immediately enter some prestigious industry editing gig. Because, if you're the person who spent 2 years of your life just looking at every word written about games, you'd think that these places that are writing words about games would be eager to snap you up. But it definitely seems that the opposite is true. It seems like the publications tend to treat their human workers as kind of replaceable machine parts or something, we give you kind of a good enough salary to not starve with, barely, and if you get out of line, we'll just fire you and we'll replace you with another person who can, talk to the audience about whether they thought the graphics were good or something like that.
I don't think I don't think it's a shock for many to realize that those kind of outlets may have different kind of goals than a person like you or a person like me. They have a different kind of, I guess, compulsion, for lack of a better word. But, do you feel that, bigger publications or quote unquote, those sites, do they impact the way that video games are broadly thought of and discussed? I kind of would like to distinguish, influence to be not just, on message boards and social media. I don't know. They must have more of an influence than, a curator on Critical Distance, like you were saying, or some lone person on Medium or something,
Right. Yeah, like it's really, there's so many different ways to look at an idea like, influence. There's so many different
right.
theories of change about how societies change and stuff. One of my favorite kind of lenses to go to here is just your classic materialist lens, your Karl Marx. You're like, where's the money going and why and who's controlling most of it?
Yeah, and who's benefiting.
Yeah. I think it would, the editors at these kind of like really capitalist-oriented verticals will often say things to the effect of like, we're not really in control, right? We're just, the industry's huge. The industry puts out products. We kind of are at the end stage of that. We comment on them. We have our readership, but they're much smaller than the rest of the industry. I think that that's like super true. One of my favorite go-to things is like media theory, Marshall McLuhan style, like media theory.
Sure.
So when I try to look to like materially, who are the big causes? What, like, if you want to find a cause, you want to find not just someone who is a contributor to the problem, like they might be a minor contributor, but like the principal ones. And I look towards things like Facebook, Twitter, the kind of media giants through which we conduct so much of our lives. I mean, now during COVID, we conduct our lives almost exclusively through these media. Mm-hmm. And, people tend to think of these things as being a sort of neutral third party. Like Twitter is not bad for me. Twitter is just a tool I use. It's the people on Twitter or the things happening on Twitter that I attach a value judgment to.
Right.
But for me, it's the opposite thing, right? I think, I heard your show with JP Leberton, and I believe he was talking about this too. These media systems aggregate attention on a mass scale in different ways. And I think it's this general concentration, this increasing concentration of eyeballs upon the most profit-generating entertainment products. A concentration that is achieved every day by Twitter as we filter through it, right? Millions of people are using this every day, and the collective output of that is this grand sort of accumulation, a very capitalist style accumulation of things like attention and money around the current winners of our society, Disney and Disney's products and the big AAA game products and Animal Crossing. Mm-hmm. And of course, the accumulation of that, this was all a very different structure than the blogosphere world. I would say it was the structure, the social networky structure of blogs and the lack of commercial hooks in all of it. That was what really permitted the video game essay to flourish. And since then, we've kind of just been slowly bleeding that idea dry as we are, converting our media systems from that kind of more egalitarian view towards today's hyper-focusing on the winners sort of view. So, this is the trend that I would say probably most significantly accounts for the sense that a lot of us have about the, contraction of opportunities to really get out there and express yourself in different ways with essays and feel like, you were making an impact. It's hard to impact people. You can't find 1,000 people to regularly read a blog anymore. That's practically unheard of because we don't log onto the internet and go to a blog ring anymore, right? We log onto the internet and we open Twitter, and then Twitter's just spewing us a bunch of stuff about how America's president is a fascist and how Animal Crossing's cool.
I feel like there's a third thing in there, but I can't remember.
There's probably 5 or 6 things, but there might not be 7 or 8. It's a pretty small number of things.
That's true. Yeah. I mean, from the, and hopefully, I talk about myopia, and hopefully, this is the thing I kind of get uncomfortable with is I do think it's an odd time to be maybe not aggressively advocating for thinking about games in a different way, but definitely if you were midstream at this point, that compulsion will still carry, but I guess like, I mean, these are all questions that don't really have answers, but it's like, well, like you were talking about how to kind of like bridge this gap and for more meaningful criticism or thinking about games to be possible more broadly, like you were talking about how you need to do a lot, you need to offer a lot of context, about what makes video game experiences meaningful. You talked about special preparation that you need to do. I mean, this is a kind of tap dancing that I'm used to doing with pretty much everyone I might be talking to for this, because I don't know where they're at. I don't know if I say the word video game, it's going to freak them out. I don't know if it's going to make them angry that I want to talk about them. You never really know. But so like if we've had this great flattening and then Animal Crossing aside, like why do you think we're not seeing more of this kind of stuff at more types of places? Because I'm sure, yeah, you're right. Like it does have roots in it kind of being an unpaid thing you do out of, maybe I should say it's done out of love rather than compulsion. But like, even if more places offered the opportunity that weren't even very high paying, you think that there would be all sorts of people coming out of the woodwork, or even people who come long before us who would be willing to, or maybe not, maybe it's too much work and it's part of a different revolving door. So I don't really know what my question is here. It's just like, why does it seem to be narrowing and not expanding?
Okay, yeah. Like, I guess we can look a little bit at what it would mean to expand. Or, I was talking about this idea that you have to prepare somebody to enjoy a game. So, like, I can contextualize that just a bit more. At Heart Projector, we do these alternative video game arcades. And all that means is we have a sort of a weird venue that was, we were able to organize in the city of Vancouver. We have our 10 laptops that were all kind of donated by people and they're all falling apart. We load games usually from itch.io onto them. We invite people to come and have a party of sorts where they play the games on the laptops. They chat with each other. Some substances are available to use. We have a bar, although we don't want it to be like too drinky. It's bad in the game industry when things get too drinky. So like this whole thing that we're doing with this like event night and this party is a way of crafting a context for the humble small itch.io game so that it becomes cool, essentially. I think that one mistake that's commonly made around games is, again, it's my Marshall McLuhan thing coming out, thinking that the surrounding contexts don't matter, that the content of the game is the only thing.
Right.
But it's simple to disprove. Like, if you're like on some crowded airplane flight or something and you're uncomfortable and you're miserable and you open your laptop and play a game, you're just not going to enjoy it as much as in other situations.
Right.
And that isn't, it's not just that a game can be disqualified by being uncomfortable. It's this whole spectrum. Like, if people are just finding these, if you discover a game as some weird thing on the internet, like you find a URL pointing to itch and it takes you to one of like Natalie Lawhead's pages and the art is all, early 2000s internet aesthetic and stuff like that, which is pretty alienating, I think, for a contemporary audience or something they maybe haven't seen. There's a huge difference between like, I have the sense that this is like an exclusive, cool, happening cultural experience that I'm like almost lucky to be in on, versus this is some detritus that I discovered on the grand pile of detritus that the internet becomes more and more every day. And that's the key thing, I think. You can't it's not enough to just manufacture games that are different. Sorry, at the start of this paragraph, I was mentioning, like, what would it mean to expand? We think that what it might mean to expand what games are, it certainly doesn't mean make bigger games or more expensive games. I don't want to do that. It probably means making really, really different looking and different feeling and different playing I would say that expanding for us just means having a sort of plethora of difference, of diversity around. Itch.io has that. But you can't just treat that like some viral payload that you shoot at somebody and then it infects them and now they love the game.
Right.
You gotta it's not enough to just have the game maker. You gotta have someone framing it. You gotta have it becoming the valuable cultural experienceness of it doesn't even really come from the artifact itself. It just comes from all of the surrounding stuff. Really, it comes from other people. It comes from your friend, from someone. When you see your friend believing that this is a cool and amazing experience, that makes your experience more cool and amazing. And I think that that's the fundamental way that you organically grow the enjoyment of really anything. I have friends in real life who play the real life sport of Quidditch, for example. The way Quidditch grows, the real life sport, not the fictional one, is by people doing it at a park and other people see it and they say, that looks cool. And then the Quidditch people say, yeah, it's really fun. Quidditch is actually one of the most brutal real life sports. It's interesting. Mm-hmm. But that's like a grassroots growth model. And for alt games, that same model we found at Heart Projector, yeah, it totally works. When you have like a person in front of you who's chatting with you and kind of infecting you with their belief that this small game and, their knowledge and their experience about what's cool about these games, that works. And I think places, the internet generally, the current attention economy generally works to suppress all of that kind of stuff. It's so much more invested in convincing you that like Animal Crossing and Red Dead are cool.
Yeah, I don't want to make it sound that I'm coming to you with the pre-assumption that that's the point of writing about games. It's a particular focus of mine, I think, because maybe I'm a masochist and maybe just because it seems like the ability to connect these dots, it's not as far away as many people think, but there's definitely difficulty in the translating of it, and also just the throwing down drawbridges that are inviting. I don't know if drawbridges are ever inviting, but I think you're right that to expand them, it's not enough to make games that are different. So, I mean, I never actually asked you this, but like, do you feel like with your writing, like, maybe you don't think of it in terms of goals? Because I know I really don't. I have to do a thing for a couple of years, and then I realize in hindsight, oh, this is why.
Right.
I mean, it sounds so lofty to say, oh, I'm trying to expand games, but are you just trying to reason through things for yourself, or what kind of drives you to I'm taking not pen to paper, but maybe you take notes that way?
It's definitely just like carpal tunnel to finger to keyboard key for me.
Oh, yeah. What about in your mind, though?
I'm all about this idea that like, then it's neural net to neuron to finger. Mm-hmm. Non-dualism. But anyway, I don't want to talk about non-dualism. I want to answer this question.
That's okay.
So like my different hats that I wear in my life have developed remarkably different underlying motivations, which is interesting to me. When I do my Heart Projector stuff, I am very much the like hopeful grassroots organizer person. Like explicitly, the reason I do that is to grow the local public's appreciation for games, for alternative games, and so on. Like it's absolutely a thing with a political end. It's like I do view it as a form of political activism, as a form of volunteer work, and that kind of thing.
You called it grassroots even, so that doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. But for the other side of it, the essay side of it, unfortunately, it's because these days it's just because I feel so angry. And it's mostly an outlet for this sense of anger that I can't control.
What are you angry about, or more than one thing? Because there's no shortage of things these days, but even through the quote-unquote narrow scope of video games, but because I'm sure you're not distinguishing between those two. But yeah, what are you reacting against and to?
I mean, so I just had I ended up like in sort of an argument the other day with my friend Louise about this, because she was just pointing out to me the thing you mentioned before, that like, yeah, like advocacy for small games does happen at trade publications. It happens a lot at ones like Rock, Paper, Shotgun. It happens less frequently at other ones, but it's a valuable service that writers do for not a lot of money, and it materially makes a difference, right? She said, I got into small games through these people. And the reason we were sort of arguing is because I tend to have this galaxy brain cynicism perspective about everything these days. I would tend to have like kind of a shittier attitude about it that was something along the lines of like, this is small, like playing this small ball, writing 400 words about why the audience should maybe play this little game, and having to preface that with like, just remember it's nothing like anything you've ever seen before, and don't expect it to have a high frame rate and all of this stuff.
Like apologizing for it almost, yeah.
Yeah. The apologetic, like, I don't have enough space to explain to you why this is really great, but please play it. Because I tend to do this galaxy brain cynicism thing, and yeah, it's because I feel angry. I feel angry about, I guess to some extent, my feeling is that gradually, the more time I spent trying to write about games, the more fixated I have become upon not the actual work that I would like to champion, which is where I started from, but upon all of these things that are blocking it, that are taking up all of the space. I think back to the moment like Gamergate.
Yeah.
I think about the Gamers Are Over piece that Lee Alexander wrote as sort of a call to action for progressives within the game space generally. It was like we were sitting on the top of this upswell of, the blogosphere had with some success entered the commercial sphere and was still operating there to some extent through these websites. It seemed like alternative games were kind of on this upswing at the time, etc. But at the same time, there was the general rising like global inequity. There was the rearing of the head of this like fascist movement in the United States again, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And this piece, I guess I have this thought about that Gamers Are Dead piece, that by rights, it maybe should have been the most important like video game essay since since the New Games Journalism one, that it had the potential or by rights should have been this like watershed moment. Because what it was saying was like, okay, games are changing now, that we have a force of people who want it to tilt rightward and just be about like gamers and booth babes, blah, blah, blah. But we also have the progressive wing of gaming was sort of stronger than it had ever been in some ways. There were people who just really didn't want it to be about that anymore. Right. And she kind of held up both sides to us and was like, okay, this is getting a little bit dangerous now. This hate mob thing is kind of kicking up now. Which of these two futures do you really want? Do you want to just... And the other thing was that, although all the regressive people said she was lying, or they're all lying, gamers are not dead, or whatever, the material, like, objective, all Lee Alexander was really doing was just looking at the data on charts and pointing at it. It was like mobile games was going to take over everything, and it has. Gamers did become not the most important audience. That was just going to happen. It was everyone who could look at a sales chart could kind of see that. So it was not even this idea of that she was so far ahead of her time, and that it was like, that was kind of how people acted, that it was too much too fast. But my view of it is she was just pointing at like some stats charts.
Yeah, I mean, if you
were inviting us to move forward.
Of that stuff, then it was like, oh, finally, someone's gonna articulate this thing that's in the air that we're all breathing.
Yeah.
Because I think it was like long felt in many pockets, but just maybe not through a megaphone of that size.
Yeah. And, Alexander was someone who had done more of the game blogging kind of bullshit than anybody, I think. And had to write the same pieces over and over again a lot. And I imagine was tired of it. And just like, can we please break out of this silly, like, trade publication based playing these like blockbuster products and treating them like they're War and Peace or something? Like, can we just break out of that and actually try to be like a progressive video game society? And unfortunately, it's like the answer was a really hard, really brutal, really resounding no. It was like, no, we're going to pretend that the gamers aren't dying. We're going to just kind of let this hate mob rip through people kind of as much as it wants until it's kind of finished. Like the industry people were all just going to basically be totally silent. The writers who complain too much are basically kind of going to get laid off. And then over the ensuing 6 years, all of the jobs that had people like Alexander and Tim Rogers and stuff kind of writing the essays that were a bit spicy and a bit cool for money, those were going to go away pretty quick and be almost unheard of. And there's going to be mostly the type of work that's like, reformat the industry news du jour and put a personal spin on it and out the door. That was like this turning point in my brain where it was like, okay, this person, Lee Alexander, is like the best person who ever wrote essays like this, in my opinion. My opinion was, I'm never going to be better at writing them than she is, ever. And like, look what they did to her,
Right.
So
that's why
from that point, I had...
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
No, please, you.
Oh, I was just that, like, that was when I think the story I had in my head of me as, essayist, going to contribute to understanding this medium, going to help it grow, going to, like, champion the most interesting work. All of that foreclosed. And I would have been happy to just stop writing essays after that point. But because of the addiction that I have to it, I ended up keeping writing them. But then more and more, they were just about, like, trying to dissect all of the various like levers that were pulled and forces that activated in order to achieve the foreclosing on of like the game essay future that I was kind of excited about back then.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, the tools I picked up instead is just kind of getting people on the phone and just talking to them and talking to as many people as I can. And of course, now I'm at the point where I'm like starting to feel that itch. I'm like, I think I have to start writing some of these things out. Like I submerged last year and I did a book, and now that's been delayed because of this pandemic. So now I feel like I'm in this funny, weird spot where, like I think of like that really old like Tom and Jerry cartoon where like one of them is standing on the phone cord and there's all this like signal pent up in it, and it's waiting to erupt, but it's like, you can't, it doesn't matter what you go through, you still have these ideas. And so
yeah,
like I totally feel where you're coming from. I mean, do you think that that's a worthwhile thing though, is thinking about like throwing down drawbridges, or is it just better to, maybe it's not a binary, but I think it's like, I think you're more interested in like owning that anger and speaking through it, whereas I feel I'm like, yeah, I'm very cognizant of this anger, but a lot of other people are aware of it, so I kind of want to like kind of translate this stuff. I think that's like a latent theory I have. It's like, well, maybe some of this stuff can open up if we figure out how to let other people in a broader way, not in the way that like Animal Crossing pieces do. I'm really not attacking it. It's just like, it's interesting because like,
me too.
Because it's like you would never see like, hey, did you know that like cabbies really love whatever TV show? It's just like, it's this weird way that video games are sort of, it's through that presupposition that like, hey, video games are still weird, right? Like we can all agree about that. So I don't know how we get around that. Maybe that's not up to you or me, but I do feel like that's one of the best ways to help us find each other is to sort of plant a flag or plant a beacon and just sort of talk about it, you know?
One of my closest sort of peers in my journey as a game industry programmer person is Semelicine, who's also that's his alt games maker name. Mm-hmm. And a thing that he would always talk about during, we're in this moment of increasing global crisis, etc. Everything's very scary. Mm-hmm. He read this book, and I can't remember now what it was, but the basic point was that grassroots movements and political change usually begins by a bunch of people losing, right? It's not that, climate change is a problem, so we're all going to get together and we're all going to vote to stop it, and then it stops and we're done with it. That rarely ever happens. Usually you try to provoke some confrontation, not unlike, I think, the confrontation that Alexander wound up provoking along with the other involved forces back then. Mm-hmm. And you lose the confrontation. That was always the point. It's like a Bernie Sanders type thing. When you're a progressive person, the point is to provoke a conversation that you will lose. But where the change happens is then through this rhizomic network of people being inspired by that or being embittered by that. And then years later, some things change and this stuff kind of grows in the background and in the underground. Right. And then the change kind of happens in fits and squirts in ways that are hard to predict. And that's a thing that Semelicine will often talk about, kind of a way to have hope during these dark moments. That it always looks like the good people are losing, and they are always losing. But the winning that does happen always kind of is hidden until it happens. And I think there's a similar type of on my better days, on my feeling better about things days. This is an attitude that I can have about this craft of writing seriously about games.
Which kind of day is it today that you're having? I feel like you may have started having a good day, and I'm trying to nudge you into having a bad day, talking about all the problems.
Well, the truth is that the stuff I just mentioned about Lee Alexander and stuff has been pulled out of my most recent thing that I've been drafting because my brain made me do it was some kind of essay about an argument that the Gamers Are Dead Game of Sutra piece is the most significant games writing piece of the last 20 years or something like that. We often love to especially in games, it's all about significance and relevance and salience. It's like that thing I said about the victors writing history and stuff. The story by default is almost about what is significant everyone is talking about. And I had this idea that when the progressive people go out and do their losing in order to get change later routine, we tend to look at that as a thing that didn't succeed, and we don't identify it as a watershed moment. But I'm well, maybe we should. Maybe it still was. So that's the stuff that's on my brain at the moment. I would say it's not exactly a very hopeful mood about games, but I do think it's at least moving me towards articulating a fresh and different type of doom than I've been stuck on in recent months. So it feels kinetic and exciting in some ways. It's maybe this can be another starting point or something, to try to unbury that thing that was written into the record books as a big old L, and maybe recontextualize it a bit and be well, it wasn't a loss exactly. Maybe in the same way that the Sanders campaign's defeat was a loss by the rules, but not a complete defeat. I feel hopeful. I was looking at materials from that era, looking at this list of 400 people who, when the hate mob was kicking up, all signed a petition urging the industry to act against it. And, it's interesting to find all the names that you recognize, look for the people helping, that sort of idea.
Mr. Rogers?
Yeah.
Yeah. That was a... yeah, no, I hear you. But I think this is the problem sometimes too, and I think why I think of Drawbridge so often is, I mean, it's refreshing for me to be able to hop on and talk with someone for the first time like here, and it's like, oh, we speak exactly the same language and understand all these same things, but you try to explain it to anybody who hasn't paid attention to this stuff even for the last 5 years, and so like I think like really the question is like, okay, so what is at stake here? Like, what are we talking about? I understand why there's a big L, but what does a big W look like? Like, what is it that you're sort of... I understand that you want to see different types of work out there and also be championed in the world, but are there other win conditions that you're hoping for?
Yeah. Well, so because I was just kind of refreshing myself on this gamers don't have to be your audience piece. I was kind of going and looking at, well, what were the claims that she said were the things that were getting better in the industry. And I think that those all still are pretty relevant. I'll just direct quote one of my favorite lines from this piece. Suddenly a generation of lonely basement kids had marketers whispering in their ears that they were the most important commercial demographic of all time. So she's describing a thing that was true in the 90s that had changed or was supposed to change. So there's one that I can point to, right? This, a W for me, the biggest possible W really is just getting out from under this whole business of targeting people with the stuff that you want them to buy, A W would be having people acknowledge that video games are not about this is what sold the most and also you need to get this computer processor because it's going to run games better and it only costs $600 or whatever. Why don't we just look at games as folk art, as just an act of human expression. A thing that makes me hopeful that we can get that's not even a W we need to get, because for people who are not already being targeted with these ads that Alexander mentioned, that's already true. Because when we put on heart projectors and we do get people who are a little bit less steeped in game media, that all we really had to do, all we had to do at all was kind of just frame this so it's a little bit like an art gallery. And immediately these folks are able to look at these games and they don't see poor graphics. That's just not something that even occurs to them. They're just thinking on a level of okay, what's this thing about? What's it trying to communicate to me? The person at the door told me that this was sort of like an art project. So what's it trying to say to me? That's a massive W to get a person, to just get people increasingly disconnected from the drip feeds that exist distributed throughout our media systems, and just getting them to look at, getting them to think about this as just a way to be human at each other, I guess. And removing as many of those preconceptions as possible. Every single preconception that we remove is a win for me.
It's interesting you put it that way, because I feel like in what I've been doing, I don't know if it was at the point where I did an even deeper dive and started on a book, but I felt like at a certain point I needed to pull up, because I had drilled down really far and I learned a lot, and it's stuff that I realized it would only serve to further kind of alienate communicating the stuff with more people, because I feel like the people who have their hands stabbed with this, like you and I, we will find stuff that's smart. I guess I'm calling myself smart. You could be the judge. We'll find stuff that hopefully is insightful, kind of organically. And I felt like there's really a need to, like, I felt like a very strong impulse to, like, I need to stop being as aware of, like, every dumb drama online, every, dumb article written to get people to rage share it, all these kinds of things, because there are patterns of it, and you talked about it too, kind of it feeding this churn that's out there. And that's kind of my hope, is like that's what I'm scratching is like, how do we get this stuff, and especially like post things like Me Too, or there's been so many examples of us being willing to look behind curtains that should have never been up in the first place, and yet still at like so many different opportunities games are just kind of like sitting in the back or in the middle of the class, like trying not to draw attention to itself. So I understand that like they want to avoid blowback, or there being them being anything that'll get in the way of what you were talking about, of like whispering in people's ears. So once again, yeah, I mean, I've said a lot of stuff, and there's not really a question in there. But I think it's just like, I feel like a lot of the louder, maybe I shouldn't just relegate it to like media outlets and stuff. That's just kind of the lens I have, because that's my background. But I feel like that's not really the goal of those kinds of places. Like, I'm not sure what it is they want to influence, but it's definitely more stuff that's like service oriented, of like, here's how to get every trophy in X or Y game, or it's all about like just being a vulture, stripping it clean. I don't know.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
Like, how do you? It's a script for kind of teaching people how to regard one of these projects like a vulture. I guess that's an interesting thought.
That sounds very grim, but that's.
I think vultures are nice birds. Yeah. They only eat the dead ones.
Everybody has to eat. I guess I feel like that's been kind of a working theory of this stuff too in the last 5 years, is like, is there a way those things can be more of a force for good? Because like, I do see that from time to time they do point out like, systemic problems, but then at the same time I'll see many of those same writers also like looking to dunk on X company because the trailer wasn't as, quote unquote good as it could have been, or they kind of still stoop to the level of some of the tendencies that were kind of laid out in that piece that you were quoting. So it's like, I don't even know if it's like 10 steps forward and 9 steps back. It's like 10 steps forward and 10 steps back.
Yeah. It's a square dance. You go back to like your starting position.
Yeah, in a revolving restaurant. Yeah.
Yeah. I think, I guess one thing I want to say about it is that, yes, it is possible to do good work in that space. Mm-hmm. I think Rock, Paper, Shotgun did it. Lots. We definitely have like examples of, despite people still operating on the ad-driven model and the economics kind of being similar, just kind of doing a better job, having a more of a true emphasis on diversity, not only in the people generating the stories, but on the things being covered and who's making that. That was the site that would share my weird 13,000 word video game essays. That was the only site that would share them. The only traffic that my blog ever got, because I kind of came to it after blogging had sort of ended. The only time I ever got traffic was like in those Sunday papers roundups. And that's a really interesting thing, right? Because like the editor-in-chief guy at whichever site you might go to is going to say something like, the reason we wouldn't cover your essay is because our audience wouldn't read it. It's not for them. Like, we could put it in a post. A lot of those sites would do the collaboration with Critical Distance and then publish the weekly roundup. But often the conclusion of that would be something like, that's not what our audience wants. And so I guess what that says to me is the way that you can try to do this job maybe a little better, maybe more of a rock, paper, shotgun style, is you just have to be a lot more dogged about like really defining that audience, really cutting away certain parts of that audience, right? Like, I think that's what rock, paper, shotgun must have done in order to generate like 40 or 50,000 people reading. Listen, my essays were not accessible. They were not friendly. In a lot of ways, they weren't even very good. They were very thinky. And to generate 50,000 people who actually want to be slammed in the face with thinkiness, it just requires like that has to include some amount of being like, this is not for other people, you know, some amount of not trying to get the biggest possible audience to read your, because the more you try to get big numbers, it's the classic story. The bigger your numbers, the blander your stuff. The more you're going for the middle of the bell curve, the less flair you're really allowed to include. So it means like deliberately cutting away a portion of money that you could be getting.
Right.
That's so, and these days there's so little money left swirling around in there that it's maybe just not possible at all.
I always joke and say, hey, everybody relax. There's plenty of nothing to go around.
Yeah.
Because there is like this weird territorialism. I don't know if you've sensed it, and I'm not asking you to name names or talk shit about anybody, but like there definitely is like, I've run across that. I guess I'm curious, like if you run across this where like there's this feeling of like, oh, I know what all the problems are with video games, and kind of I want to be the one to get there first, whether it's to, get a certain problem either solved or to sort of hip other people to being aware of it. Maybe it's just me and my personality, but it's like I always feel like, why can't these people with... Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm basically talking about web rings. Why don't we bring web rings back? We're kind of like a rising tide attitude rather than sharks at the moat kind of attitude. But I don't know if you... Have you run into that?
Yeah. I mean, well, it's still like, I think, you being a skilled interviewer are, of course, putting enough vagueness on that I can have run into it in a variety of forms. I'll talk about one form that was particularly like kind of energizing or animating to me. Mm-hmm. It's like, we live today in this era. There's this general sense that the heyday of like writing about games is in the past. We've been talking a lot about that, but you definitely still have people who are chugging along at the making money writing about games thing. And sometimes I will encounter attitudes along the lines of like, oh no, it's still totally possible to write about games effectively and do a great job. You just gotta like adapt your techniques more, you just gotta do these things. And it's, sometimes I'm left with this sense about like, well, you're describing a thing that's working for you,
right,
sort of almost personally, and it's only maybe working as a way to get an income. And it's just like we're not even having the same conversation.
Yeah, you just have to be very lucky. That's all you need to do.
Yeah. The classic, like the video games, right? This is everywhere in video games because it's also money dominated. Mm-hmm. This thing like, you just have to be the lucky. You have to work hard for it. Nobody disputes that everybody has to work way too fucking hard. It's just that in addition to that, you also have to be super lucky, and that probably means being a white man, and it probably also means like being from a certain time in history,
right?
Especially in the writing trade. I think that's a really, the blogging only happened once,
right?
And the people who won that are maybe, that lasts a while. If you were the one winner, it lasts a while, but then come the people who want to follow in the footsteps, and that there's no room for them, sort of thing. So like that's one way that I feel. I guess I would experience it or talk about it as like this interesting disconnect that I feel with, because like you were saying, you and I here are sort of vibing on a couple of different levels with respect to these problems. Not everybody does. There is disagreement out there. And this is where I can be maybe a little catty and say something like, the people who are winning it still definitely are more inclined to disagree. But, I am doing my leftist thing, and I always want to look at the people who aren't winning it and treat their perspective as the critical one.
I mean, I think it makes sense. People would not necessarily be for being kind of toppled or having their... I don't even know what the status is, It's like I used to be really fascinated by, like, celebrity in the game industry and, like, cult of personality and, like, I think there are fewer now, but it's like I used to be really interested in, like, personality, celebrity, and clout, and, like, what do these big personalities affiliated with X studio, like, what do they do? And so it's so opaque, like, what happens at game companies, but I've never really thought about it through the lens of, like, celebrity and clout and cult of personality with writers. So I think there's a degree of that too, but I think it plays out totally different. And my guess is that clout would probably just be like, I don't know, people want to do books, or they want to be paid more, or maybe they want a job. Like, I think clout gets used in the same way, where it's to kind of benefit themselves as opposed to this, like, lofty thing that we're talking about, which is, like, improving an entire ecosystem for many types of people who we do and do not know, and future generations, really. But I don't think we would put it that way.
Yeah. I mean, there's a really classic, one of the 48 Laws of Power about that, right? That, like somebody like the rapper Jay-Z will use this argument a lot, that, like, it's not that I'm accumulating all of this shit for myself just out of greed. It's that, like, the world is cruel and harsh, and, like, you gotta take care of yourself. And, I'm just playing by the rules of this game. Mm-hmm. I'm just hustling. Mm-hmm. That's a classic sort of rhetorical device that can be deployed to excuse yourself of needing to feel responsible for doing more of an activism type thing. I don't want to even, like, I don't want to blame people ever for this.
Yeah.
So it's like the holders of the clout are also the victims of the clout. They're just the second most important victim, right? The most important victim is the people who don't have the clout. And then the second most important victim is the ones who do. Because they're just they're in the prison of privilege, which is, the nicer of the two prisons.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a gilded, I don't know. There's a whole other weird dynamic to it too, where people who haven't really known a lot of struggle feel self-conscious and guilty sometimes, and so do all sorts of weird or unusual things to sort of, like, feel like they need to be exposed to certain types of experiences. But I don't think anyone who feels driven to write essays about video games experiences that. To kind of bring it full circle there. So I think I have just, like, one more question for you, but I know we jumped around a ton. Was there something you wanted to bring up that I didn't kind of give you a chance, or that it got jostled loose and maybe you half forgot it but wanted to mention it?
Yeah, there's one thing, and it actually just relates, I guess, to the clout point, or one idea that has just fascinated me recently that I can't get out of my head is this concept that attention can be thought of as being exactly like wealth, and that we can think about redistributing attention in exactly the same way that we think about redistributing wealth. We were talking, we're all nostalgic for the blogosphere. It feels like everybody is. You can look at that as basically just a different way of distributing attention that was more equitable. So today when the big pieces tend to get the most eyeballs, right? The consolidation has happened. It tends to be the case that the smaller percentage is getting more attention. So what if you took, this is the part that obsesses me, is coming up. What if you took Call of Duty or any game that had a huge number of players, 7 million people played this game.
Yeah.
I think for us as like, especially for me, the more cynical type critics will often point out how these commercial games, are not so good that they deserve to have 7 million more players than an alt game. So what if you took that 7 million audience, you divided them into cohorts, 1,000 people each, right? So then each of those cohorts, you just kind of prescribe them or something. Like somehow, it wouldn't work in reality, but in the toy hypothetical view, you give them a different alt game to play. The idea here is like, as a small-time creator, I don't need 7 million viewers readers or players. I only really need like 1,000. With a smaller number, you can still have a super and amazing sort of experience at being a creator in a community. It often feels like to experience and much higher to be cut or a network. It was distributed equitably. For them. And so what I think about today is like, it's these machines like Twitter that are spinning to make one project. It's bad for that one project, things like that, but it's worse for the millions of other that are getting zero just so that the popular game can make like a couple million more dollars, And so what really excites me is the prospect of any kind of solution that's going to start distributing that attention differently. And insofar as I do grassroots type activism type, like my heart projector stuff, that's the kind of decision maker that I always want to target is can we make changes that are going to modify that attention?
I'd like to.
Yeah.
I keep thinking about how it's like, oh yeah, that's all the stuff I run up against. That would be great. So unfortunately, it's above my pay grade, but it's possible this question. This question may be above yours. This is kind of just the last question I always close with. But what do you think video games have accomplished?
I think that the most important thing they have accomplished is not something that's a goal, but just a thing that happened, right? They wormed their way into so many millions of people's brains, and they live there now. Like it or not, we have a culture of video games. There's this very large number of humans for whom they're just important. They're a huge chunk of life. You think about them all the time. Like in some ways, it's value neutral, or it doesn't matter what we think about Mario exactly. His presence within human culture is just like this fact that must be reckoned with. So if we're to look towards what the accomplishments of games are, I don't think that games is like a sentient thing that moves towards goals, and so in itself it cannot accomplish things. But the outcomes of the process of everybody having these games in their brain has been, I think, fascinating to behold. Games have, for me, been a way to just kind of parse reality, I guess I'm like making an Ian Bogost argument here almost to some extent. Like, yeah, I do think that, for me, there's something about the experience of controlling a little character in a game, and that has allowed me to understand issues around capitalism, for example. That, like, sometimes I think about the way, to somebody's boss, if somebody is your boss, you're like the little virtual hockey player on the screen. Like, to you, you're tired and your bones are breaking and it's terrible, but to them, they're just hitting the speed burst button over and over because it says you have a little speed burst meter left. So, like, there's the thing the games has accomplished. It's created this new lens or tool for, like, how do you even imagine what reality or being alive is? And this is like what film has accomplished, right? It just accomplished this change in consciousness and perception, and created all of these, some good, some bad, just kind of inflection points and then changes within, like, the way it all runs, That's like what I like about games, and that's how I justify still writing the essays, to be perfectly honest. This idea that, like, yeah, it kind of is all, like, silly bullshit. I think we all sort of agree about that. But like it or not, it's in all the brains, and it's real, and that means it's important, and we're fucking obligated to treat it as if it's important.